Hello everyone. I know you're here to use this video to help you sleep better, and I'm here to help you do just that. All you need to do is listen and relax. Before we begin, you can comment below and let me know where you're watching from. What time is it now? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next episodes. Now just relax. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory lingered. It was a sobering reminder to always be cautious, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock our doors. It was a lesson that had been learned the hard way, but one that stayed with me. Late at night, I heard sounds, like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the attic floor. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a raccoon. But the next morning, I found more signs. An empty can of beans on the kitchen counter that I hadn't opened, crumbs on the floor, and the attic door slightly ajar. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the attic stairs. The air was musty, and dust particles danced in the beam of light. "I won't call the police," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go." I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Something inside me softened. Instead of feeling scared, I felt a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not going to call the police," I replied, "but you need to tell me why you're here." His name was Jack. He had lost his job and home a few months ago and had been wandering the streets ever since. He found my attic one cold night and had been sneaking in for food and shelter. I thought about reaching out to some friends who might have job leads. Jack was grateful, and I could see him starting to hope again. Days turned into weeks, and Jack and I developed a routine. He would come by for meals, and we would work on job applications and practice interview skills. Slowly but surely, he started to regain his confidence. One evening, after he had left for the shelter, I realized how much my life had changed since he came into it. I no longer felt lonely. Jack had become a friend, someone I cared about deeply. Months passed, and Jack's life continued to improve. He got promoted at work, made new friends, and even started volunteering at the shelter where he once stayed. Seeing him grow and succeed filled my heart with joy. One evening, Jack invited me to his new apartment for dinner. As I walked in, I saw a framed photo on his wall of the two of us from one of our dinners. He smiled and said, "You changed my life, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without you." Tears filled my eyes as I hugged him. Our friendship, which had grown from the unlikeliest of circumstances, had truly changed both of our lives. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night where the wind howled. He was drenched from the rain, and his clothes were tattered and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were wild and frantic, like a cornered animal. My mom gasped and quickly locked the doors. She kept her foot on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but something about him felt wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. One of the men had a crowbar, and he started hitting the driver's side window with it. The glass held firm, but I could see small cracks forming. My mom's eyes were wide with fear, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm going to get us out of here." She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar jumped back just in time, avoiding the car by inches. My mom squeezed my hand, her grip reassuring but still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay, we're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the rain beating against the car and the hum of the engine. My mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we neared our neighborhood, the rain began to let up, and the storm started to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of the streetlights. As we walked into the house, my mom wrapped her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a comforting blanket wrapping us in its embrace. We were safe, and that was all that mattered. I was 12 years old the first time I stayed home alone at night. My parents were going to a dinner party and promised to be back by 10. I was excited. At 9, I heard it for the first time, a soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone was walking around up there. I paused the movie and listened intently. The house was silent. Maybe it was just the old house settling, I told myself. I had heard my parents say that 100 times before. Trying to shake off the unease, I resumed my movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump, and the wind outside howled. Grabbing a flashlight for protection, I crept toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and I winced at every sound. I reached the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. I took a deep breath and started checking each room. The first room I checked was my parents' bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. It was dark, but everything looked normal. Next, I checked my room. Again, nothing unusual. I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe it was just the house settling. I was about to go back downstairs when I remembered the attic. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the noise again. Clear and unmistakable. It was a faint shuffling sound, like someone or something moving up there. I took a deep breath and started climbing the stairs. They creaked loudly with each step, and it felt like I was walking into a nightmare. When I reached the top, the attic was even darker than I remembered. I fumbled for the light switch and finally found it. The light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. I was about to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, and my heart almost stopped. Standing in the shadows was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was this thing? How did it get into my house? I took another step back, and the figure moved closer. My heartbeat was loud and frantic. The police arrived after my frantic call. They searched the entire house, including the attic, but found nothing. No sign of the figure I had seen. They told my parents it was probably just my imagination, that maybe I had watched one too many scary movies. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I never felt safe in that house again, especially when I was alone, because I knew somewhere in the shadows, that figure was still there, watching, waiting. That night, I finished my project from home, and no deadline was worth the terror I had experienced. To this day, I still can't fully understand what I went through. Anxiety began to creep in as the house became eerily quiet, and every creak of the old wooden floor seemed louder than usual. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I settled down on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows across the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, a soft tapping sound. I paused the TV and listened, but the noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have imagined it. But when I glanced back at the window, a face appeared in the dim light of the screen. It was a man with a pale face, wide, wild eyes, and a scruffy beard. His clothes were dirty and torn. My blood froze. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, harder this time. Snapping out of my daze, I backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the calm voice of the operator asked. "There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. I tried not to make a sound, but I could hear his footsteps on the stairs getting closer. "He's inside the house," I whispered to the operator, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet, and stay where you are." "The police are almost there," she replied. I heard him trying each door, one by one. When he reached my bedroom door, he started pounding on it, trying to break it down. I pressed harder against the door, praying it would hold. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The banging grew louder and more desperate. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard police sirens outside. I listened as they arrested the intruder. I made my way downstairs where two officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice trembling. "We've got him now. You're safe," the other officer said. A wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents returned, making sure I was safe. I told them everything that had happened, and they reassured me. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me to be more careful. I never liked working late. The silence of the empty office always made me uneasy, but I had no choice. The deadline was tomorrow, and I was way behind on my project. The office, usually bustling with the sounds of ringing phones and people chatting, was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. My name is Tom, and I work as a graphic designer. It was a Friday night, and the office was deserted. Everyone else had left hours ago, excited for the weekend. I watched the last of my colleagues leave, envying their freedom. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer, determined to finish my work. As the hours passed, the light outside my window dimmed until it was pitch black. The only light in the office came from my computer screen and the small desk lamp beside me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I never liked working late. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from sitting in the same position for so long. I walked over to the break room to get a cup of coffee. The hallway was dark, and my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh, cold light. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee was comforting. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise. It was faint, but then the screen went black. I jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried to turn it back on, but it was completely dead. Frustrated, I checked the power cable and saw that it had been unplugged. I felt a chill run through me. I knew I hadn't unplugged it. My hands trembled as I plugged it back in and turned the computer on. The screen flickered to life, and I breathed a sigh of relief, but my relief was short-lived. A message popped up on the screen. "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. I glanced at the clock, hoping the night would end soon. Suddenly, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound stopped. I took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, my steps slow and cautious. The corridor was empty, just as it had been before. I decided to check the office one more time, just to be sure. I walked past empty desks and cubicles, my eyes scanning every shadow. Then I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Then I heard it again, the whisper. It was close, so close that I could feel the breath on my neck. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide with fear. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was a figure standing still, watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. It was as if the figure was right next to me. I didn't wait to find out more. I yanked the door open with a burst of strength I didn't know I had, and ran down the hallway. I grabbed my bag and sprinted for the exit, not looking back. I burst out of the building and into the cool night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to that office. Sometimes I heard whispers when I was alone. I thought it was my imagination. My parents seemed happy at first. They worked hard to make the house a home. Dad, and then she turned and walked back to her room. The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. Things got worse. Dad became more and more ill. He was in pain all the time and couldn't work. Mom looked tired and sad. She started having strange dreams and couldn't sleep. I tried to help, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. One evening, I found an old book in the attic. It was covered in dust, its pages yellowed with age. The book told the story of the house. It had been built, and once alive, doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the walls shook. It was like the house was angry. Dad died shortly after that night. His death was sudden and unexplained. The doctors were baffled. Mom was devastated. She couldn't cope and soon fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and finally, she too passed away. I was left alone in the house, feeling its cold grip around me. I moved away as soon as I could, but the house stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I kept thinking about the house. The cycle of misfortune continued. Priests, shamans, and even modern paranormal investigators tried to break the curse, but nothing worked. The house remained a place of sorrow. Now, as an adult, I often drive by the old house. It still stands tall and proud, but I can see the sadness on its walls. I think about the families that have suffered there, including my own. I think about the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and I feel a burning desire to end it. I want to destroy the house, burn it to the ground. I can't let the house continue to destroy lives. I owe it to my parents and to all the families who have suffered to find a way to break the curse. One day, I gathered my courage and drove to the house. I stood in front of it, feeling its cold, dark presence. I took a deep breath and walked up the steps. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was heavy, filled with sadness and anger. I could hear the whispers and feel the house watching me. I didn't know what I would do, but I had to try. I had to end it now. It was empty. My job was to walk around and make sure everything was okay. Every hour, I had to check all the rooms and write down that nothing was wrong. I started my shift at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m. The first few nights were quiet. I brought a book to read and drank coffee to stay awake. I liked the silence. It gave me time to think. But on the fourth night, things changed. It started like any other night. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. and took over from the day guard. I stopped and listened. The whispering stopped too. I shook my head and told myself it was just the wind. At midnight, I was in the basement. The basement was the creepiest part of the building. It was cold and damp, and it smelled like mold. I was about to leave when I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no answer. I shone my flashlight into the corner but saw nothing. At 3 a.m., I had to do my next round. I was nervous, but I forced myself to go. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The whispering started again, louder and clearer. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't understand the words. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned around quickly. The room was empty. I searched, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the office, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what I had seen. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the monitors again, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. At 5 a.m., I was exhausted. I just wanted the night to end. I decided to do one last round. As I walked through the building, I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I couldn't handle another night in that building. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, I hear the whispering in my dreams and wake up in a cold sweat. I'll never forget my time as a night shift security guard. Back in the late summer of 2010, I was just about to start graduate school, and I had to find myself a new flat for the coming year. I was new to the area, so I didn't know the neighborhoods at all, and since I needed something cheap and cheerful, I ended up browsing vacancies in some of the city's less affluent areas. Some of the listings were frankly terrifying, and I'm surprised the landlords had the audacity to even advertise them. Others, however, were considerably more livable, or at least they appeared that way thanks to some carefully chosen angles and a lot of window shots. Over the course of a week, I'd booked 10 different viewings, and by the end of the third day, I was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. A playful exaggeration on my part, of course, but honestly, it was just so draining. I'd been to 6 of the 10 viewings that I had lined up, and each and every one had been a complete letdown. The places were either riddled with mold, obnoxiously close to a restaurant or bar so that they stank of old chip oil and cigarette smoke, or they were the size of a shoebox. Luckily, my next viewing, which was late in the afternoon the following day, was with a landlady that had advertised a females-only listing. The pictures of the place made it seem quite nice, and I was very attracted to the idea of living in a SE, secure environment. Space because of the added security it would bring. I know, maybe to some of you that might sound a little cynical, and I'm well aware it's not all men who pose a problem, but in the context of what I'm about to tell you, I refused to apologize for my cynicism, or as other girls might phrase it, realism. Some guys are just creeps. It's a fact of life. So the idea of living with just girls in a shared house was massively appealing. But then, that would be massively appealing to just about any girl moving to or living in London, surely. Getting a viewing appointment would be impossible, or so I thought, but it wasn't. I got one within a few days, which I thought was me getting lucky, but really, that should have been my first red flag. I was just way too optimistic to see it. The next day, as I got the bus over towards Camden, I remember being a mix of excited and nervous. I had so much faith in the place and had texted with the landlady, a woman named Jan, so I was confident that it was going to be a decent place. But at the same time, I'd been let down so relentlessly over the past few days that I had this looming sense of dread as I got closer and closer to my stop. At the time, I thought it was just residual trauma from being continually disappointed, but now I'm starting to think it was more like a kind of spidey sense. And so I got off the bus and I immediately texted Jan to let her know that I was nearby, as she'd asked me to do because she said she was really busy and might need a reminder. She texted me back almost right away, but when I expanded the message notification, I saw it was a lot more than just a simple okay or thanks, see you soon. It said something like, "Hi, I've been terribly busy, so my brother-in-law will be there to let you in and show you around." So much for female only, right? I thought that was the whole selling point. But then I understood that Jan was probably a very busy lady if she owned several properties all over London, so I wasn't about to throw a fit over one little thing like that. And so, off, I went to meet up with Jan's brother-in-law and to view what could potentially be my brand new home. When I arrived, I saw that the flats were in a unit above a line of shops. I'd been instructed to knock on the door, so I did. And when the door opened, Jan's brother-in-law was standing in the threshold. He looked strange, and that's putting it nicely. The way he looked at me in those first moments of eye contact made me feel a lot less comfortable than I did before. I mean it when I say that I'm not some man-hater, but I wasn't at all pleased about having to deal with a man in what was supposed to be a female-only flat complex, especially not since he was giving off these creepy vibes. If it had been any other circumstance, there's no way I'd have stepped into an empty room with that guy, but I'd pinned almost all my flat-finding hopes on this place. So I put on a brave face and a polite voice, then stepped inside and followed him to the flat. As soon as we stepped inside, my heart sank. It wasn't remotely like it had been advertised, not just because it looked like someone was already living there, but because I was pretty sure the pictures weren't even of the same place. I asked Jan's brother-in-law when the current tenant was due to vacate, and my heart sank even further when he said something like, "Well, yeah, that's the thing. The property we were going to show you has been taken off the market, and this is the only one we've got available for you in this area, and it's a shared unit." That was all very disappointing to hear. Devastating, even. But the thing that mattered most was securing somewhere to live and ensuring it was female only. Potentially, I could cope with a new flatmate as long as she was a girl, but when I asked the guy if the current tenant was female, he literally dodged the question. I asked him, plain as day, is it still an all-female occupancy? And he responded with, "If you'd follow me this way, I can show you the vacant bedroom and attached bathroom." Then he just trotted off like I hadn't asked him anything and opened up the... I followed him into the bedroom, thinking I might as well have a look. While it wasn't actually all that bad compared to some of the others I'd seen, he still hadn't answered my question about the unit being female only. I looked around the bedroom and, remaining polite, asked him once again if the unit was female only or not. The man sort of wiggled his head and made a face that suggested he wasn't sure. He then said he'd have to contact Jan to make sure because he didn't know off the top of his head. I was starting to get really annoyed, but I kept my cool as he asked if I wanted to see the attached bathroom. I was literally on the verge of just saying no when he stepped forward and opened the door. As he did, I was hit with this truly revolting smell. It was so bad that I winced. I know the guy saw me wince from how rank the smell was. So when I said, "No thanks, I think I'd like to have another look at the kitchen," I'm pretty sure he knew I was lying, unless he really was as stupid as he looked. Honestly, I just wanted to get away from the smell, and I didn't care at all what the kitchen looked like when the bathroom bloody stank. I was actually just going to walk towards the front door and see myself out after a brief and very passive-aggressive word of thanks. But then as I walked, something clicked about all the stuff that was left around the flat. By that point in my life, I had lived with girls and only girls. Even from when I was a kid, my dad wasn't around, and it was just me, my sister, and my mom. Then when I left for uni, I only lived with girls there too. Not to be too crass, but I knew what boys' bedrooms looked like. And that's what clicked in my head as I walked through the flat. It looked like a man lived there. And of course, I knew that it was a man living there, because the guy wouldn't answer my bloody question. But it seemed like a certain type of man lived there. This is where I made a huge error in judgment. I put it down to the continual disappointment and the stress of thinking that I was going to be forced to pick some absolute crap house to be miserable in for the next year plus. But when I realized that it wasn't just any old man living there, but the one currently showing me around, everything started to fall into place. I got out my phone and called Jan's number. As the guy followed me out of the bedroom, his phone started to ring in his pocket. I wasn't supposed to have his number, was I? He was just supposed to be meeting me there. So hearing the phone that Jan had been texting from start ringing in his pocket confirmed all my worst suspicions about this man. And he knew it too. He knew I'd figured it out, and I wish I'd been wearing a bloody GoPro. Because the look on his face was one I wish I had framed as a picture hanging in my bathroom. I think that's what did it, how I sort of, sensed his weakness. I had caught some absolute waste of a man trying to trick desperate girls into living in a spare room he looked like he built himself, with some really dodgy plumbing too, by the smell of things. Red-handed. That was the phrase that came to my mind in the moment. Red bloody-handed. And I'd be damned if I was about to let him live it down. I remember trying to think of something witty to say, but all I could think of was to ask him the exact question on my mind, I suppose as a way to humiliate him. So I started asking, "Were you trying to trick young girls into living with you?" His face turned as red as a tomato, but he still tried denying it. The indignation I felt from his denial only spurred me on. I started telling him how pathetic he was, what a pervert he was, and how he was probably on the sex offenders registry. I gave him both barrels, as they say, didn't hold back in the slightest. But I forgot the golden rule when dealing with men. They're bigger, they're stronger, and the mental midgets among them are only one piece of wounded pride away from using that to their advantage. I saw the moment I pushed him over the edge. It really was like that meme, and it was in that moment she knew she effed up. He stopped talking, gave up on denying everything, and then started marching towards me with this wild look in his eyes. I knew he was going to go for me. I got a head start running down the corridor toward the block's entrance, but he was just too fast. I almost made it to the door and had my hand on the latch when I felt something tugging on my hair. I felt the pressure on my scalp, and then the next thing I knew, my neck jerked back as the guy grabbed a handful of my hair and started dragging me backward. I tried to stay on my feet, but the force of him pulling my head back knocked me off balance. As I fell backward, I realized he was actually trying to drag me back toward the flat, using nothing but my hair. I remember screaming for help, hoping someone from the other flats, there were maybe 3 or 4 on that floor, would hear me. But if they were occupied, whoever lived there must have been at work or dead, because I screamed so hard that my nose started to bleed, and no one emerged from any of the doors. Once I realized I was on my own, and we were just feet away from him, dragging me back into his flat, I tried to flip myself over so I could at least stand up, but right when I found a bit of purchase on the carpet underneath, I felt something slam into my face so hard it made the vision in my left eye go all white. I brought a hand up to my face, covering that eye, and with my free hand, I made a desperately futile attempt to get his hand off my hair. The second my hand touched his, and I tried digging my nails into the skin of his hand, he violently tugged on my hair again and sent me crashing down onto my knees. I remember how, as I reached the doorway, he tried to drag me through it, but I made it very hard for him by blindly kicking and throwing punches, anything to try and hit him in the groin or scratch his eyes out. After making contact with at least one of my swings, I have a gap in my memory, presumably from where the guy hit me so hard that I fell unconscious for a minute or two. My last memory of trying to fight him off was as we reached the door, but the next thing I remember is being on the bedroom floor, with him dragging me towards the bathroom that stank of mold and rotten God knows what. There was this pain in my neck when I woke up, and I had a deep fear that if I tried to twist my way up to bite him, he might tug on my hair hard enough to break my neck. I was more terrified than I had ever been in my entire life. I had no idea what was happening, but the one thing I knew was that if he managed to get me into that bathroom, it would be all over for me. I remember rolling over, and it made my scalp burn with pain from all the hair that had been ripped out, but it allowed me to wheel around and grab the guy's wrists. He obviously thought I was still unconscious, so when I suddenly started moving, it took him completely by surprise. I was able to sink my teeth into the skin of his wrist until I saw his fingers open and felt my hair come loose from his grip. I tried to run, but he grabbed me again. This time, I remember launching myself at his face. He was trying to pin my arms by my sides by wrapping his arms around me, but I raised them too early for him to get a hold of them and started digging my fingernails into his eyes. It was so horrible because I could feel the bare flesh of his eyeballs giving way under my nails. It really makes me shudder to think about it now, but at the time, all I could think about was doing as much damage as possible, and it worked. He screamed so loud that it hurt my ears. Then he suddenly shoved me off him so hard that I went tumbling to the floor. I felt so dizzy that I struggled to find my feet, but it didn't matter, because the man intent on ending my life, and God knows what else before that, was in so much pain from scratching his eye that he couldn't see. He was covering them with both of his hands, screaming terrible, terrible things at me. But I listened to all of that as I was running towards the front door, knowing that there was no chance of him catching up to me. I remember coming out into the street outside and walking down the metal stairs that led up to the unit really fast. Then some woman saw me as she was walking past and exclaimed, "Oh my God, are you okay?" I had a cut on my face from where he hit me. I'm guessing that was the blow that knocked me out too, and it had been pouring blood down me without me realizing. When I saw just how much blood there was, I was terrified that he might have stabbed me or something. So I unzipped my jacket and started looking for stab wounds while saying to the woman to call the police. More and more people came over because the way I looked and the way I was shouting obviously attracted a lot of attention. I kept pointing to the door I had come through, saying, he's in there," because I felt my legs getting weak, and I honestly thought that I was about to pass out from the bleeding. If I passed out, I didn't know if I'd wake up again. Obviously, that was all just the terror talking, and despite all the blood, I didn't even need stitches after being taken to the hospital. But in that moment, I was the most scared I had ever been in my life, and convinced the guy had done way more damage to me. The police managed to track down the man who had attacked me, and he ended up getting a prison sentence of 6 years. I think if the jury were able to see into his head and got a glimpse of what he had in store for me, he'd have gotten much, much longer. Sadly, that's not how the law works here. And as much as I have my own trauma as a result of what happened, my worst fear is that he'll get his chance to do it again sooner rather than later. During the winter of 2015, 34-year-old Lenny Royal was living in Brighton, a vibrant metropolitan city on the southern coast of England. Lenny was originally from New York City, but after falling in love with an Englishman more than a decade ago, he had been splitting his time between Britain and America while pursuing his lifelong passion for hairstyling. However, Lenny was no ordinary hairstylist. He continued to maintain a reputation as one of the most talented professionals in the world. His clients included celebrities like Hailey Baldwin and Sigourney Weaver. Because he could easily find work on both sides of the Atlantic, his transatlantic lifestyle was both feasible and profitable. But towards the end of 2015, the breakdown of his 12-year relationship became the catalyst for a harrowing series of events. It's not exactly clear how Lenny's relationship came to an end, but by his own admission, the breakup sent him into a deep and debilitating depression. Lenny was prone to such bouts of melancholy, having already endured his fair share of personal tragedy. As a young boy, both of his parents passed away after contracting HIV, which led to the exceptionally deadly acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. Lenny's father was a heroin addict who contracted HIV through shared needles. He unknowingly passed the virus on to Lenny's mother. When young Lenny learned that his parents were going to die, he was terrified. Watching them slowly slip away had a profoundly terrible effect on him. The separation from his boyfriend during the winter of 2015 brought about similar feelings of grief and loss, which in turn brought back terrible memories of his parents' deaths. Lenny knew he had to do something to shake the depression he was feeling. After a period of contemplation, he downloaded a dating app called Grindr. Lenny was undoubtedly looking for what is commonly referred to as a rebound, a brief love affair believed to boost the recently rejected self-esteem. In the process, he matched with a 24-year-old Scottish man named Daryl Rowe. Daryl, originally from the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, had also suffered through a rough upbringing. Although the details of Daryl's early childhood are murky, we know that he was adopted by two foster parents named Jackie and Harry when he was still a boy. His foster mother once described him as a really lovable boy who was good company. However, it was painfully clear that they had adopted an extremely damaged child. When Daryl arrived at their home in the nearby seaside town of North Berwick, Jackie and Harry noticed that his body was covered in scars. They were also concerned that Daryl had brought with him not one, not two, but 120 Barbie dolls, over which he displayed a fierce protectiveness. Jackie and Harry tried their best to raise Daryl, sparing no expense in the pursuit of turning his life around. However, when Daryl entered his early 20s, he suddenly announced that he was leaving Edinburgh and moving all the way down to Brighton, England. Although unconfirmed, it's easy to assume that Daryl moved to Brighton because it has long been a historical haven for young gay men. Oscar Wilde was a frequent visitor to the city, with one local historian explaining that Brighton has long been a refuge for those seeking freedom from the strictures of conventional society. Daryl thanked his foster parents for everything they had done for him, promised to stay in touch, and ultimately relocated in April 2015. About 8 months later, Daryl and Lenny connected on Grindr. After an initial period of flirtatious conversation, Daryl suggested they meet. At first, the idea of meeting excited Lenny. Daryl was 10 years younger than him, and knowing that he could attract someone so young and handsome made the older Lenny feel much better about his recently dissolved relationship. In fact, Daryl seemed to be in awe of Lenny's age, experience, and glamorous profession. However, the pride Daryl's charm reignited in Lenny may have seriously clouded his judgment regarding what happened next. Daryl and Lenny texted back and forth for a few days, toying with the idea of meeting up for a date. But then, one day, Daryl made a suggestion that made Lenny feel deeply uncomfortable. When the subject of physical intimacy arose, Daryl seemed to flippantly dismiss the idea of using a prophylactic. In other words, he flat out refused to wear any kind of protection. For Lenny, this was a definitive red line, and although he and Daryl had already exchanged phone numbers, he was so offended that he began the process of blocking him on various social media platforms. It was only at the very last second that Daryl managed to salvage his attempt at romance when he made a categorical promise to wear protection if they became intimate. Daryl might have saved himself from Lenny's blocked profile section, but he was still on thin ice. Over the next few days, he worked to regain Lenny's trust by swapping a series of innocuous selfies with him. His efforts paid off, and it was around this time that Daryl convinced Lenny to share his home address. Daryl later said the exchange of information was simply part of getting to know his prospective date. But just hours later, Daryl showed up on Lenny's doorstep. Naturally, Lenny was surprised by Daryl's sudden appearance, especially since Daryl called his cell phone using a withheld number before announcing, "I'm outside your door." Yet somehow, Daryl managed to talk his way into Lenny's home, most likely through sheer flattery and possibly with a dash of emotional blackmail. Perhaps there was talk of a miscommunication, with Daryl saying how he'd come an awfully long way just to turn around and go home again. There's no doubt that Lenny made a sizable error in judgment by allowing a near stranger into his home, and by his own admission, it was an extremely regrettable decision. Yet the price he paid is the stuff of nightmares. After a few hours of drinking and flirting, the two men climbed into bed together, and at Lenny's insistence, Daryl swore he'd wear a prophylactic. Once their lovemaking had concluded, the prospective couple engaged in deep conversation, with Daryl sharing his passion for veganism and juicing. Lenny then attempted to share some of his own interests, but shockingly, Daryl tried to convince him of the benefits of drinking his own urine. Things got a little weird, as Lenny later put it. Then I was like, okay, this was nice, but you need to go now. Lenny made it clear that he wasn't rude to Daryl. He simply informed him of some very real dinner plans he had made for that evening, thanked him for a lovely time, and politely asked him to leave. On the surface, Daryl respected Lenny's wishes, but in the days that followed, he made it clear that he'd felt deeply. Daryl not only complained bitterly to Lenny, but he also became increasingly erratic when he felt that he wasn't receiving the proper amount of attention. To Lenny, it was clear their budding relationship had no future whatsoever. So, after informing Daryl of his wish to part ways, Lenny blocked his number, preventing him from calling or texting. About a week went by when Lenny received a call on his cell phone from an unknown number. Curious, he answered the call, only to hear Daryl Rowe's voice on the other end. "How dare you block me?" Daryl demanded. "You honestly think that you can get rid of me so easily? You'll never get rid of me, ever. You're going to burn, Lenny. You're going to burn." Once it became clear that the sole purpose of the call was to unleash a torrent of abuse, Lenny Royal ended the call and blocked the number. He believed it was nothing more than the work of a bitter former lover lashing out in spite. Little did he know, Daryl's words had a horrifying significance. 2 weeks later, Lenny woke up one morning feeling a little under the weather. He figured that he had simply caught a cold, and with the proper rest, would most likely recover in a matter of days. But when a few days turned into an entire week of malaise, Lenny visited a pharmacist to purchase antibiotics. However, after describing his symptoms, the pharmacist strongly recommended that he visit a hospital for a more in-depth diagnosis. Lenny did as advised and underwent a full checkup following a visit to his local GP. Then, when the results of various tests came in, Lenny received a call from his doctor, one that would change his life forever. Lenny, who believed that he was suffering from little more than a stubborn strain of influenza, was told that he was HIV positive. "I felt like that was it. My life was over," he later said. "I was crushed." Following the death of his parents, Lenny had moved in with an older cousin, whom he later came to regard as his adoptive father. He was devastated, Lenny said. "He felt like he'd failed to protect me from the very same thing that killed my parents. And he promised my mom I'd never suffer like she did. I had to tell him it wasn't his fault over and over, but he still cried. He still said he felt like a failure." In the weeks following his diagnosis, Lenny made repeated trips to a local medical clinic to receive medication and examinations. Being the social butterfly that he is, Lenny often engaged the clinic's nurses in casual, and sometimes not so casual conversation. In one case, he even shared intimate details regarding the events leading up to his diagnosis. As he spoke, the nurse Lenny was talking to turned ashen-faced and at first appeared hesitant to speak before saying, "I really shouldn't be telling you this, but you're the fourth person this has happened to in the last 6 months alone." Lenny couldn't believe his ears. Assuming there had been some kind of miscommunication, Lenny reiterated that in his deepest, darkest thoughts, he wondered if a former lover had deliberately infected him with HIV. There had been no miscommunication. The nurse confirmed that in the recent past, 3 additional men had reported being deliberately infected with HIV by a recent lover. Not only that, but the same malevolent person had actually taunted them via phone calls following their infection, hinting cryptically at the ordeals that awaited them. The first was a man in his early 30s, Stuart Roger, who made contact with Daryl using the dating app Grindr back in July of 2015. In a very similar fashion to his interaction with Lenny, Daryl was insistent that he and Stuart meet at the first available opportunity. He insisted that Stuart stop by his Brighton apartment, and when he did so, Stuart found the front door open and unlocked. "Just come on in," Daryl said via text message. "I'm waiting for you." Shortly after Stuart's arrival, he and Daryl became intimate, and as far as Stuart knew, Daryl had worn the appropriate protection. However, once their intimacy had concluded, Stuart noticed that a prophylactic device had been removed from its packet, yet appeared completely unused. Concerned that Daryl had somehow deceived him, Stuart sought assurance that the prophylactic had been employed. Daryl flippantly dismissed his concerns by asking, "Are you one of these paranoid people?" "Yes, I wore protection, so chill out." Once sufficiently reassured that Daryl had complied with his wishes, Stuart attempted to engage his new lover in conversation. Yet, when Daryl seemed much more interested in showing Stuart his favorite Pokemon videos on YouTube, Stuart suggested that they part ways and arrange to see each other again soon. Again, Daryl seemed to take the polite dismissal in stride, but not long after Stuart's departure, he called him on his cell phone. Stuart assumed the purpose of the call was to arrange a second meeting, but when he answered his phone, Daryl remained silent. Stuart asked if he was okay, but again, Daryl chose to stay silent until he eventually ended the call without saying a word. Having demonstrated himself unsuitable for a mature relationship, Stuart opted for no further contact with Daryl. The increasingly erratic Daryl continued to reach out, but just 8 days later, Stuart received a flurry of text messages from an unrecognized cell number. "You're a revolting jackass," one message read. "Ha! I'd taken the protection off." Stuart was stunned, but he didn't understand the message's true significance until a few weeks later when he began to feel gravely ill. The second of Daryl's more recent victims was a man named Peter, who matched with the young Scotsman after realizing they frequented the same gym. He was a good-looking guy, Peter later said. He was also very charming at first, but that all changed very quickly. Daryl repeated the pattern of insisting he and Peter meet as soon as possible, and then when they did, he told Peter that he would not be wearing any protection during physical intimacy. Peter was hesitant. He knew the risks involved, but Daryl swore on all that he held dear that he was clean and that any intimacy they shared would be safe. However, afterward, the same post-coital pattern played out. After displaying a shocking level of immaturity, Peter proposed that they part ways. Yet just days later, Daryl sent him a text message informing him of some utterly terrifying news. "I lied," the message said. "I'm HIV positive." Peter was horrified and asked Daryl if he was serious or merely attempting to psychologically terrorize him in revenge for discontinuing their tryst. "He's making this up," Peter told himself. "He's just being childish." But Daryl was not making things up. He had deliberately infected Peter with HIV. A third man named Andrew shared a similar story. He matched with Daryl via the same dating app as the others, and at first, there was a great deal of chemistry. He was hot and seemed like a nice person, Andrew later recalled. At the same time, I didn't have any reason to question that. When Andrew and Daryl met for the first time, neither of them was carrying any kind of protection, but they decided to become intimate regardless. Andrew ended up staying overnight at Daryl's place, and later claimed that at that point, he believed they might kindle a long-term relationship. But this time, it took less than 24 hours for Daryl to turn on him. The following morning, as Andrew traveled by bus to his home, he decided to check for any new messages on the Grindr dating app. However, when a user activates the app to check messages, it notifies connected users of their activity, and this is how Daryl discovered Andrew was still using the dating app. Less than an hour after they parted ways, this discovery sent Daryl into a rage. "I can't believe you're online already," Daryl told Andrew via text message. Andrew initially thought Daryl was kidding and that the message constituted nothing more than flirtatious banter. Yet, when it became evident that Daryl was genuinely furious and that his show of possessiveness was not an attempt at humor, Andrew blocked him on all platforms and resigned himself to move on. However, just over a month later, while Andrew was out drinking with a coworker, he received a series of text messages on his cell phone. "I hope you enjoyed yourself," the first message read, followed by another with a smiley emoji. "I have HIV, and now you do too." The timing of Daryl's text messages is extremely significant. These days, if someone is exposed to HIV, they can obtain a drug known as post-exposure prophylaxis, PEP, which can stop an infection if taken within 72 hours. Daryl could have easily informed his lovers of his HIV status, but he deliberately waited weeks to drop the bombshell, knowing he had exposed them to one of the deadliest diseases in modern history. When each of Daryl's 4 victims realized his claims were legitimate, they experienced a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and fear before rushing to the appropriate medical services for testing. In some cases, the wait was just 24 hours, but every second of gnawing uncertainty was nothing short of psychological torture. Andrew sat alone, guzzling a bottle of wine and praying the results would come back negative. The next day, when the call from the doctor came, he trembled with fear as he went through the formalities of confirming his identity. Andrew had almost resigned himself to the prospect of living out what little time he had left as an HIV carrier, eventually suffering from AIDS. But once the security formalities were out of the way, the doctor told Andrew that his test results were negative. He almost collapsed with relief. The same could be said for Peter, who also received the all-clear after a brief but agonizing wait. Stuart Roger, on the other hand, was not so fortunate. When informed by his doctor that he had contracted HIV, Stuart was devastated, but he swiftly informed the police of Daryl Rose's actions, providing them with a detailed description of Daryl, his cell phone number, his home address, and several screenshots of their text message exchange. "From the moment I got my diagnosis, I was acutely aware that I would have to report this," he later said, adding that Daryl was obviously an exceptionally dangerous person who urgently needed to be stopped. Thanks to the information provided by Stuart, the police were able to track Daryl to the nearby town of Saltdean before placing him under arrest. To ensure he couldn't escape, the police opted for a dawn raid rather than a regular knock at the door. After smashing their way into his apartment, officers discovered Daryl in bed with another man, later revealed to be his 8th known victim of deliberate transmission. Upon seizing Daryl's phone and investigating the extent of his criminality, police uncovered hundreds of potential victims across his multiple social media accounts, many of which were established under false identities. Each of these men had to be contacted by police and informed of their potential diagnosis. Following his arrest, Daryl was interviewed under caution, and the number of charges against him rapidly ballooned from 1 to 4 to 7 in the space of just a few hours. During the recorded interview, Daryl claimed he wasn't aware of his HIV status, but this was an outright lie. By the time of the interview, Daryl had been explicitly aware of his diagnosis for almost 12 months. The police knew he was attempting to deceive them, and while he could have been tried in England, most of his offenses were committed in Scotland before his relocation to Brighton. As a result, he was transferred into the custody of Scottish police and transported to Edinburgh. For reasons unknown, once across the border, Scottish police chose to release Daryl on bail into the custody of his foster parents. However, almost immediately after the emotional reunion, Daryl attempted to escape justice by hiding in the Pentland Hills, which loom over the city of Edinburgh. When Lenny heard that Daryl had escaped police custody, he was furious. "I couldn't believe they released him," Lenny said, "especially since he kept saying that he was going to do it to other men." He was obviously sick in the head. During a search of the Edinburgh countryside, police eventually found an abandoned tent containing a carton of prescription medication, an antiviral used by HIV carriers. The name on the medication was Daryl R. Police already suspected Daryl was hiding in the Pentland Hills, but what was particularly alarming was that all the pills remained untouched in their blister packets. The medicine's purpose was to make his infection less contagious, and by refusing to take it, Daryl's intention to recommence the infection of others was chillingly clear. By November of 2016, the hunt for Daryl Rowe had entered its 11th month, and around 25 additional victims had come forward to report physical interactions with him. Naturally, the police focused their searches around the cities of Brighton and Edinburgh. However, little did they know, Daryl had made his way to Newcastle using the pseudonym Gary Cole. Daryl attempted to keep a low profile but continued to use dating apps to infect additional victims, the first of whom was a man named Tom. "It's always been nearly impossible for me to approach a man," Tom later confessed. "I guess that's probably why I've been quite gullible." Daryl managed to convince Tom that he was in love with him and ended up spending a total of 3 months living under Tom's roof, completely rent-free. He said that I had nice eyes and that he liked older men. "I was very flattered," Tom admitted. "I might have fallen in love with the guy, but Daryl's behavior soon shifted from charming and thoughtful to manipulative and malevolent. Let's just say that he was able to control me in a way I won't ever allow again," said Tom. Meanwhile, police forces in both Scotland and England were busy scouring the internet for any trace of Daryl Rowe. Their search led them to an escort website where a detective noticed stark similarities between the body of an advertised subject and Daryl's. They also had a cell phone number connected to it, and when police triangulated its signal, it was determined to be in the home of Daryl's unsuspecting lover, Tom. Officers rushed to Tom's home, but when Daryl realized he had once again been tracked down by the police, he attempted to escape. Trapped on the home's upper floors, he leaped from a third-story window into the garden of one of Tom's neighbors. However, when he landed on the wet grass, he slipped and fell on his back, severely injuring his spine and fracturing several vertebrae. The police found him lying there in a lot of pain, Tom said. He couldn't move or walk properly. Assuming Tom was an accomplice who knowingly harbored a criminal, the police took him into custody for around 5 hours. However, once he discovered who Gary Cole really was, Tom's arrest became the least of his worries. Thankfully, the police issued him a 30-minute HIV test, and he breathed a sigh of relief when the results came back negative. "That was obviously good news," Tom said, "but I didn't really feel any better. I felt used." As Daryl was brought to trial, it marked a watershed moment in British legal history. Never before had anyone been tried for the crime of deliberately spreading a dangerous pathogen. After viewing a catalogue of damning evidence, including the texts in which he taunted his victims, a jury of his peers found Daryl guilty on 5 counts of causing grievous bodily harm and 5 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm. The presiding judge then sentenced him to life in prison, telling Daryl, "You waged a determined and hateful campaign of violence. The messages you sent make it crystal clear you knew exactly what you were doing. As well as the physical offenses, it is clear that the psychological effects upon the victims are immense." The judge added, "It should be known that this sentence is not about stigmatizing anyone living with HIV, but I cannot envision a day when you will no longer be a danger to gay men." It's reassuring to think Daryl was jailed for his actions, even if it was for a mere 5 years. Lenny later said, "But what he inflicted on his victims will stay with them for the rest of their lives." "I was pretty worried when I got my diagnosis," Lenny continued. "I thought I was going to be that person no one would ever want to be with. But while there's still some prejudice in the gay community, a lot of people don't really care. I had one negative experience with somebody I was dating, but it didn't really affect me." "It's no longer a death sentence, not even remotely," Lenny said. "But it's messed up when somebody makes that choice for you, when they take that right away from you. That's what's difficult to get over. It really is a harsh reality when you think about it. And that's the cruel thing I struggle with on a day-to-day basis. How can somebody be so cruel?" I was out hiking solo in the wilderness, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the wilderness. As I trudged along the narrow trail, my eyes caught sight of something in the distance. An old abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by time. Curiosity piqued, I veered off the trail and made my way toward it. The cabin was weather-beaten and run down, but there was something strangely alluring about it. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The interior was dark and musty, with dust motes dancing and the faint light filtering through the windows. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I shivered, suddenly feeling a chill in the air. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't resist exploring further. I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers along the peeling wallpaper and cobweb-covered furniture. It was like stepping back in time. As I made my way to the back of the cabin, I stumbled upon a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. My heart skipped a beat as I lifted the rug and peered into the darkness below. With a shaky breath, I descended into the cellar, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. The air was thick and musty, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. The cellar was small and cramped, with shelves lining the walls filled with jars of preserved food and dusty old books. But as I scanned the room, my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. A makeshift altar, adorned with candles and strange symbols. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, someone who practiced dark rituals in this remote cabin in the woods. Panic surged through me as I turned to leave, but before I could reach the stairs, I heard a sound behind me. A low, guttural growl that froze me in place. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw him. A man emerging from the shadows, his eyes wild with madness. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips as he advanced toward me, a sinister smile playing on his lips. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst through the door and into the fading light of the setting sun, sprinting through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches clawed at my skin, and roots threatened to trip me up. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the trail. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the terror fueling my every step. It felt like hours before I finally emerged from the trees, gasping for breath and covered in sweat. But even as I collapsed on the ground, my heart still pounding with fear, I knew that I had escaped. I had survived the horror that lurked in the depths of the forest, and I would never forget the terror of that abandoned cabin. I'm a truck driver hauling freight across the country on a regular basis. It's a lonely job, spending long hours on the road with nothing but the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of highway to keep me company. But I never expected my latest delivery to turn into a nightmare. It was late at night when I pulled into a rest stop, the darkness swallowing the landscape like a thick blanket. I was tired and ready to call it a night, but I still had a long way to go before I reached my destination. As I climbed out of the cab and stretched my legs, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. A lone hitchhiker, holding a sign that read West. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should offer the stranger a ride. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down my spine. But before I could make up my mind, the hitchhiker approached me, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild look about him that made my skin crawl. He asked for a ride, his voice low and raspy. I tried to refuse, to tell him that I couldn't take passengers, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. Reluctantly, I agreed to give him a lift, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But as he climbed into the cab and settled into the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we drove down the deserted highway, the hitchhiker grew increasingly agitated, his movements jerky and erratic. He kept glancing out the window as if he were expecting something or someone to appear out of the darkness. I tried to make small talk to keep the atmosphere light and friendly, but the hitchhiker didn't seem interested in conversation. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he pulled a knife from his pocket and pressed it against my throat. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in mortal danger. He demanded that I pull over, his voice low and menacing. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. With trembling hands, I reached for the emergency button on my dashboard, hoping to summon help before it was too late. But before I could press it, the hitchhiker lunged at me, his knife slicing through the air with deadly precision. I managed to wrestle the knife away from him, but not before he landed a blow to my shoulder. Pain shot through me as I fought to keep control of the truck, my vision swimming with adrenaline and fear. Even as I struggled to maintain control, the hitchhiker kept coming at me, his eyes filled with madness. I knew I had to get him out of the cab before he killed me. With one final burst of strength, I slammed on the brakes and sent the truck skidding to a halt. The hitchhiker was thrown against the dashboard, giving me the opening I needed to push him out of the cab and onto the side of the road. As he lay there, stunned and disoriented, I seized the opportunity to escape. I climbed out of the cab and ran as fast as I could, putting as much distance between myself and the hitchhiker as possible. Then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw the lights of an approaching vehicle up ahead. With renewed determination, I flagged them down and begged for help, my hand shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. With their assistance, I was able to get to safety and receive medical attention for my injuries. It was a terrifying ordeal that I'll never forget, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the darkness for those who dare to trust the wrong person.